Hi everyone, welcome to the What, Why, When podcast from Oxford University. My name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics and what is known as the Access Fellow at Jesus College, which is one of the 39 colleges that make up Oxford. And I'm here with my amazing colleagues. Let's go in alphabetical order.
I'm Imaan, I'm the Digital Access Officer here at Jesus.
And I'm Leah, and I'm the Access Officer here at Jesus College.
So the aim of these podcasts is to recreate Oxford tutorials, which is the primary teaching method at the University of Oxford. These are small group conversations around difficult problems. And so these podcasts ought to be of interest to anyone who just likes thinking about complicated topics, but also anyone who might be thinking of applying to highly competitive universities and wants to know more about the skills we look for. Today's topic is language, so the very medium by which we intend to go through all of these podcasts, because I'm very interested in how the rules of language emerge, who invents words, how they're propagated, and if there are some sort of dastardly power structures at root behind the way we communicate with each other. So starting off with an opening question, which is how we would start most tutorials in Oxford. Who tells you what your words mean? How do you know what they mean? Who invents them? Have you ever thought of inventing a word yourself? If so, how would you go about making it popular, etc., etc.? Who comes up with words, basically? What do we think?
I think it's one of those things where if everyone agrees on what the meaning of one word is, then it will get standardized.
Right.
And that's basically what gets collated into dictionaries, and then everyone agrees on the meaning of a word.
Right. You sure everyone agrees?
Well, maybe not everyone.
But like a critical mass or something like that, a sufficient number. But it's still pretty nebulous, isn't it? The idea of getting a word into an authority like a dictionary. So, Leah, you've probably heard of the Oxford English Dictionaries, which are written here in Oxford, of course, by the Oxford University Press, which is in many ways the preeminent collection of the English language. Do you know how they decide what words mean?
I mean, I'm guessing a lot of it is like accumulated over time, and like groups of people have decided what words should be added, and then as the years go by, they add in additional words based on what kind of emerges out of trends and things.
That's right. So there's a big team over there at the OUP, and they look for the origins of words as a guide to what they were originally intended to mean, but then they also revise those meanings quite regularly to update them with more current usage. So exactly as you've both been saying, the broad editorial policy is quite democratic insofar as they want to try and reflect back at British English users how they actually use their words. So do you have any examples of words that have been added to the dictionary in recent years that you quite like or you find interesting for any reason?
Not sure if this is a new word, but I know vibe is quite
quite
a trendy word at the moment.
Right. It's not so exactly. So that's a good example where the word vibe obviously has been in the dictionary for a long time, but the newer usage of it, as you say, has been added. Yeah, that's really cool. What about you, Leah?
Yeah, I'm gonna throw out brat.
Brat,
because,
yes.
that I feel like it probably has been in the dictionary for a lot longer.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, it must have been, but I guess it's probably been
Not in the Charlie XCX.
Yeah, I was gonna
style,
say
yeah.
the context has changed a little bit and how we use it or what we associate with.
Which is kind of cool, isn't it? That language is so open and changeable. It's this sort of medium that can adapt to new circumstances. I think that's amazing. And I've got a friend who works at the OUP, and he once told me that between 5,000 and 6,000 new words and new usages are added every calendar month to the dictionary, which is pretty astonishing. A lot gets taken out as well, so it's not just stuff that gets put in. But does that surprise you about the rate of change to the language?
Yeah, that's a huge amount. I'm also surprised to hear that they take words out.
Yeah.
Don't know that.
Yeah, so real archaisms, because it is supposed to be reflecting English usage, I think. And so if it's not used, then it's not necessarily English. But there's still quite a lot of authority going on here, because as you said at the start, Imaan, they've got to try and figure out how we are using our words and what general consensus there is on what words mean. But that's very difficult to determine. And ultimately, there's a team who have to decide what certain words do or don't mean. So, for example, how would Leah, if you were tasked with writing a pithy one-line definition of this following word, how would you do it? The word is literally.
Okay. I guess kind of like something you're taking in like a certain sense or like at face value.
Yeah, right. And what's the antonym? What's the opposite? What sort of words could we use to mean exactly the opposite of literally? Sorry, I'm kind of putting you on the spot now.
I'm going to pass this one over to Imaan.
Figuratively?
Yeah, exactly. So if we're using a figure of speech rather than precise words. So I could say, for example, I'm literally over the moon to be starting this podcast. that wouldn't be accurate because I'm not flying out in space, right? I'm figuratively over the moon because it's something that's joyous, right? The issue is that people have been misusing the word literally so much that the dictionary had to recognize a new meaning for the word. So, for example, in the Olympics last summer, I was watching the BMX events, and a commentator said, "This competitor has literally got BMX in her veins," which, I don't need to tell you would be a lethal condition if it was true. But he meant she figuratively has BMX in her veins. The beautiful thing is that that's actually no longer an incorrect usage. The Oxford English Dictionary has acknowledged that lots of people were saying things along the lines of, "Can't believe you've just said that, I've literally just died," and using literally to mean figuratively. That if you go and look it up, it's actually got two meanings, and the second meaning for literally is not literally. So what do you think about that? Do you think that sort of makes a mockery of the rules of language, or do you kind of like how nonsensical sometimes language can be? What's your view, Imaan?
It's a great example of semantic change. But again, there's a reason why the meaning of words can change. And I'm trying to think of what the actual reason is why the meaning of literally did change. But I don't know. I suppose if something becomes a trend and people start to realize, oh, this is a really good way to emphasize how much I care about this particular subject, something, it's literally this, it's literally that, then yeah, it would make sense why other people would pick that up to match that energy, and then it becomes another alternate meaning for that word.
Right, yeah, exactly. And so I think that's quite a positive process. Some purists of language get a little bit upset that they feel that the language is being somehow sullied, but I think English is a bit of a mess, if I'm brutally honest, and it's got lots of irregularities and odd rules. Why on earth would the plural of child be children, for example? So I think if you're looking for absolute coherence and purity in your language, then English is not a good shout. I mean, what about French? So French is an interesting comparator because in French, the dictionary writers are not quite so moved by democracy. It's a slightly more authoritarian approach. So the dictionary in France is written by l'Académie Française in Paris and by a group of people who are, no joke, known as the immortals, which is quite a strong categorization of any individual. And they effectively tell the French people what is proper French. So they won't acknowledge all usages as correct, even if they're widely spoken. So, for example, do either of you know what the French word for weekend is?
I'm gonna take this one
Go on.
and butcher the French pronunciation, but the most used one is le fin de semaine.
Well, so exactly, that's the official sort of correct French. That is what is in the French dictionary. So the end of the week, literally. But the quite common usage is just le weekend. Mm-hmm. So people in colloquial French will quite commonly just say le weekend, but that's not in the dictionary and it's not acknowledged as proper French. And indeed, there would be some minor sanctions involved if you were to use le weekend in, say, a public exam, as I understand it, or in a job application, because it's not correct French. It would be considered as a mistake. So what do you suppose is the beef with le weekend, Imaan? Why don't the dictionary immortals like that?
I suppose because it's not what they would consider original French, but why that's necessary, I'm not so sure.
Right, that's exactly the problem. Is it's a loan word. It's been borrowed wholly from English, probably because it's slightly less of a mouthful than le fin de semaine. But as you say, they don't want to incorporate that into official French. What do you think is their problem with it, Leah? Why might they be nervous about just admitting that if lots of people use this word, it's a French word?
I guess it's kind of like a culture and heritage thing, and trying to maintain language, and especially I guess considering it's how widely used English is, and as a lot of English speakers will go to countries like France and just attempt to speak in English all of the time without. So I guess it's kind of them kind of reasons combined to wanting to uphold the original French rather than just turning it into a version of English, essentially.
That's precisely right. So it's a bit like maintaining a beautiful building. You don't want it to decay. And the fear is that although French is widely spoken around the world, it's not as widely spoken as English, and in particular in youth culture, English is widely used. So there is a fear that if they don't uphold it, then French could dilapidate. Can you guess what language after English is most rapidly making its way into French colloquialisms, especially among the young?
Perhaps just thinking about the colonial history, Arabic.
Yes, that is exactly right. It is Arabic. And similar story where the French dictionary writers would not admit certain popular Arabic words to be admitted as official French. So let's flip it back to English. I mean, can you think of any loan words that we use that are from French? It's been estimated about a third of daily English comes from French since the Norman conquest of 1066. So it's a lot to choose from.
Yes. I guess cafe.
Cafe, classic, yeah.
That's the one I was going to say. Though.
Any more for any more?
I mean, there's certain like food items that
Yeah.
we refer to in their French name, like a croissant.
Croissant. Okay, so what I always encourage my students in Oxford to do is to think more childishly, to sort of ask questions in a sort of persistent manner like a 5-year-old would do. So why is it called a croissant? What does croissant mean in French? Any guesses?
I don't know what it means.
So it literally means crescent. And so I guess that makes sense because croissants are sort of crescent shaped. But when you're thinking in this childish mode, you need to keep pushing, right? You need to keep following the white rabbit down the rabbit hole. So why would croissants be crescent shaped? What could that symbolize? What perhaps world religion, hint, hint, is represented by a crescent moon?
Yeah, usually Islam is represented by the crescent moon. I think from the Ottoman Empire. Started from there, I think.
I didn't know it's from the Ottomans. That's really interesting. But yes, of course, yeah, Islam is typically represented by the crescent moon. And so that gives us a hint as to the possible history of the croissant. Indeed, it has been suggested that croissants were first developed in Vienna, in Austria, not in France, by bakers who were celebrating the fact that the Ottoman armies didn't make it to the gates of Vienna. So it's effectively an old Islamophobic symbol, which is slightly surprising. Now, I would hasten to add that anyone who enjoys the daily croissant is not nowadays perpetrating an act of Islamophobia. But what's your reaction to that? Did you know that fact?
No, didn't know that before you told me. Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's interesting how something like the shape of a food or the original inspiration behind that can go into a food item and then into possibly loan words. It's very interesting.
Yeah. So it's somewhat easy to figure out French loan words. What about Arabic loan words in English?
I know a couple. So alcohol surprisingly originates from Arabic, from the words alcohol, which I think means something to do with a powder used to create something.
Oh, right.
There's also algebra.
Right.
And most of these are food items, but also syrup and sugar both
Interesting.
originate from Arabic words.
There we go. So even, words we wouldn't necessarily realise were from Arabic. Of course, there's a few that we would probably realise, like Ramadan, which you would find in an English dictionary, but is obviously an Arabic word originally. So there's a few, but not as many as French. But as you pointed out, the French loanwords derive from their colonial legacy. We have a lot of loanwords that are related to the British colonial legacy. There's quite a lot of words from Hindi, for example, like pajamas and veranda. So there's a caravan. So various things. I think it's caravan. Anyway, that might be Persian. I could be wrong. Anyway, let's not get too hung up. The idea is that these words come from all over the shop. But in English, we are not so fussed about loan words because it would be kind of daft to pull up the drawbridge now. But we might be tempted to sort of conclude that English is somehow more democratic than French. But before we get too haughty, let's talk about pronunciation. Could you please tell me the correct way to pronounce the word scone?
I'm going to say scone.
Scone, yeah? What do you reckon?
I've changed because of people who have been around me pronouncing it differently.
Okay.
So originally I thought, scone, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now I say scone.
Oh, you're
I don't know
both
if there
scones.
is a correct one, yeah.
Right, so I say scone, so we've now got the makings of a fight on our hands. So can you, I think I'm particularly interested in mine by your change. So what do you think is the logic or the reasoning behind your change in pronunciation?
I just want to say, if you're around people who are pronouncing words a certain way, you're more likely to, not even unconsciously, but you just start talking like them and you start pronouncing words the way they do.
Yeah, absolutely. And Leah, do you have any other reasons why you call it a scone?
Mainly just because everyone around me did, and I've never had any reason to call it anything else. And because it sounds like other things, like a stone, and
Yeah, sure.
so that's kind of my logic behind
Or even
it.
if you take the S off, you've got a cone on your hands, haven't you? So
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite tempting to apply logic to this, isn't it? To sort of try and prove a correct pronunciation. Do you think there is such a thing as correct pronunciation? What would that even mean? Correct in what sense? Correct according to the laws of nature? I mean, what?
Yeah, I guess like there's obviously going to be a pronunciation, like if you press the word on like Google and it'll give you like a specific pronunciation of something, but
I don't know if it does for scone or scone. That's
I
a
have
interesting
not,
find.
yeah, I've not tried out.
Sure, they
Can't
can,
say
they can give us an approximation. Sorry.
No, I guess just kind of like it, a correct just kind of isn't necessarily a thing, but I guess it's like normal or what the most common, maybe most common instead of normal would be the best way to phrase it.
So it can be tempting to try and apply logic, but English, as we've already mentioned, is not logical or coherent. So, you know, if, for example, I was to take the word laughter and slap an S on the front of that, I would suddenly have slaughter, and thereby demonstrating that consistency in a pronunciation is not such a thing. But people get really quite uptight sometimes about pronunciation. You know, they sort of die slightly inside if a tourist asks them for directions to Leicester Square. Why do you think people are so sensitive, Imaan? I'm not all people, obviously, but why are some people quite sensitive to it?
That's a good question. If you were asking me, as long as I can understand what they're trying to say, then I don't personally have an issue with that. But I can definitely
you're a very open-minded person. Not everyone will have the same view, I dare say.
I think maybe because it gives connotations of that person being an outsider or not like the in group. They're not from around here, or they don't know what that place is, and so I'm not going to mentally accept them.
Yeah, I think that's right, exactly. And as you were saying, both of you, that when you grow up with a community and they say words in a certain way, and all of a sudden someone comes along and says it a different way, that immediately signals their outsideness, and that can be quite triggering for some people. I think one thing that I find particularly disturbing is how my accent is perhaps often described as a neutral accent, or maybe even received pronunciation, basically sort of posh white man from the southeast of England accent. And the reason I have some misgivings about this is because I don't think there's anything neutral about it, because the implication is that it's somehow in the middle of a distribution of pronunciations. It's somehow perhaps correct. But as we've discussed, there's not really any such thing as correct. And I wonder whether my accent being described as neutral is more just people saying, because you are from a privileged background, you probably are using English properly. And all these people with their thick regional dialects and their brogues and their accents, they're getting it wrong. Do you see what I mean? It feels like we're sort of judging people for deviating from the Southeast English white male accent. Am I being oversensitive academic here, or am I on something? What do you reckon?
No, I can see. I think I'm just thinking back to when the BBC would only show. Is it received pronunciation that they would?
Yeah,
only
RP. Yeah.
Yeah, they would only have speakers speaking RP, and regional dialects were not condoned.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's changed now, but maybe there's something about the perceptions that had been created at that time that have now carried over till now. Maybe people have certain connotations of dialects, and even though they might not actually have any real basis behind them, it's just a bias that comes to mind.
And we can all, if we're not alert to it, be subject to those biases, right? It can be tempting to think that other people are butchering our language if they get it wrong. And a common, that's obviously common between, say, British speakers of English and American speakers, or New Zealanders and Australians and so on. It's a similar story with, say, Spanish speakers in Spain versus Spanish speakers in Mexico. Intriguing difference is that in Spanish in Spain, it's not uncommon for people to gently lisp some of their words, like gracias and cerveza. And an apocryphal story states that the reason that Spaniards lisp gently is because a former Spanish king called Philip II had a quite pronounced speech impediment. And in order to avoid embarrassing him, everyone obtained a lisp for the rest of recorded time. Wow. Now, that has not been verified. That is a story, and it's probably not true. But I suppose it sort of slightly cheekily highlights the possibility of how much power can be involved in the way people use their words, and how they can sometimes be encouraged to denigrate their background and their upbringing for the sake of power structures. What do you make of that possibility, Leah?
I think it's very true, and like still kind of withstands that, like as Imaan said about how we like we do just categorize people still, and based on power. So the idea that power's kind of shaped our accents, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. So what about spelling? So Iman, if I was to write in an email to you the word COLOR, I have committed an American spelling of the word colour, but you would likely understand what I intended and you would comprehend it fine. So what do you imagine is the problem with me misspelling the word colour?
I think it would just be deemed incorrect, but by whose standards, it's difficult to say. Also, just thinking about academic writing, for example, if you were to write colour without a U in an essay or something, I can't say might, it would be flagged as a spelling error, as is the case with any other academic thing, really.
Yeah.
So again, it's about just conforming to whoever is not standardizing the language, but making you spell words that way.
Oh, you're absolutely right. There are sanctions attached to misspelling. So famously, sort of SPAG marks off in school exams for spelling, punctuation and grammar. If someone wrote colour like that in an application to Oxford or in a job application, unless they were American, in which case it would be fine, we would hold it against them. But it seems slightly odd and restrictive, doesn't it, Leah? I mean, is there really that much harm done if someone misses the occasional U out of the word colour?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, you would still completely interpret the word in the same way, but you would, even like, if you didn't necessarily think negatively of it, like, you would still notice it. Like, if somebody, like, uses an American spelling, you'd straight away notice it.
Yeah.
So, like, it's not in any way harmful, because as long as the intended meaning is getting across, I don't really see why there would be any issue, but there obviously, yeah.
So, I mean, William Shakespeare famously used to spell words differently without any consequence whatsoever. He practiced different spellings for his own name until he alighted on the one we're more familiar with now. So you use the word standardized, Iman, and that's the process by which a language conforms to a set of expectations and rules. And English was standardized between the time of Shakespeare and today. Can you guess why? What was the
I want to say something to do with the printing press.
Okay, go on.
Am I right?
Tell me more.
Oh, okay.
What's your theory?
If you're distributing books and printed materials, which you would be at the advent of the printing press, you would need some kind of standardization for everyone to understand the words. I suppose you could understand the words if they were spelt differently, but it just makes it a lot easier if you're... Actually, the actual printing process would have to have the letters the same every single time, and that probably helped contribute to the standardization of...
Yeah, so it could have just been frequency of use that standardized people's behaviour. The printing press predates Shakespeare by a good 100+ years, but still, that's one possibility. Another possibility is simply just the increased rate of literacy, that today 99.9% of adults in the UK can read and write, whereas in Shakespeare's time, I mean, best guess would be it was less than 10%. So that's a deeper story. So Leah, can you guess why literacy rates exploded?
I guess, like, just for the rollout of, like, education,
right,
more freely accessible, right? Like, that's kind of where most people learn to read and write.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Exactly. So, readily available education, it's somewhat more efficient if you teach a standard version of English, because then everyone can have a shared curriculum and it's just smoother. So remember, we've got to keep diving down the rabbit hole. Why was education made more readily available? You've got to keep tugging on the threads.
I mean, I guess it's quite hard to, like, kind of deconstruct that, because to us it's like, well, it should just be like...
Oh, of course, it's a moral imperative.
Yeah, I was going to say, so it's really hard to, like, then try and reverse it and be like, why wasn't it to begin with?
Yeah.
But, yeah, I guess it would be, like, policies that were created and, like, funding into it. But there would still have to be some kind of process behind someone pushing that. So, yeah.
Did it have anything to do with the Industrial Revolution?
Ooh, go on. What do you think?
I don't have to think about it. Because I was just thinking, if the Industrial Revolution meant more people, especially kids, were also working, would that require a certain level of education and therefore mandatory schooling?
I think that's almost certainly a huge factor in it, given that the need for a literate workforce who are mostly agricultural workers is much lower than would be the need of an industrial workforce who are working in factories and in other professions. So I think industrialization of the economy is a primary motor. It's tempting from the vantage point of today to think, oh, they must have had all these high-minded moral convictions behind it, but that doesn't explain the thousands of years prior to that they weren't so fussed about teaching people to read and write, except for a particular caste of highly privileged individuals. So I think industrialization is something, and therefore, if I may put this to you, and I'll get your reaction, the language was standardized so that the humans could be standardized, was it not? Because then you have workers who think consistently and behave consistently and can be replaceable parts in a bigger economic machine.
Does make sense. It's a bit scary to think about that, but yes, it does make sense.
It's a slightly different spin on the, let's all learn because it's empowering. Do you think that's too negative, Leah? Do you think I'm sort of bordering on conspiracy theory here?
I don't know. I guess just like from the perspective of being an individual, you kind of want to
Right.
ignore that. Like you just want to be grateful for the fact of like, so, but I guess when you do sit and think about it, it's like, that would be a reason for there to be language and us all being able to communicate, not commute, but like does make a difference to how efficient everything works. Like everything would be a lot harder if we couldn't communicate.
True. So we would be potentially harmed by much more diversity. But of course, lots of people get harmed in the process of standardization, right? So languages and dialects, Welsh, Scots Gaelic, Irish, and so on, had to be sort of subordinated to the march to standard English and so on. Moving sort of into that point about individual expression, swearing, one of the most highly regulated forms of speech there is, but really difficult to figure out. We've got this naughty list of words that have somehow been chosen, by whom I'm not entirely sure. And for each of the words on the naughty list, there is a corresponding non-naughty word, which means exactly the same, which you are allowed to say and put in textbooks and so on. Where does this lot all come from? I mean, in Japan, by comparison, they don't really have the same concept of swearing. They think you can be taboo and vulgar and phobic and downright nasty using any word, depending on context. That makes a lot more sense to me. If I wanted to be utterly appalling right now, I won't, by the way, but if I wanted to, I wouldn't have to actually pluck any of the words from the naughty list, would I? So that makes a lot of sense to me. Where do you think our swearing comes from, Imaan?
It's a tricky one. I want to say if certain words were used in a negative context, if people were using it as insults and other people were realizing these are insults being thrown my way, for example, again, it's just one of those things where if a word is being used and there's a consensus that this is what it means, as is the case with swear words perhaps, then it just becomes more known as, okay, this is now a word that we don't use because it's a swear word. Right, yeah, exactly. So there's sort of generally accepted taboos. The worst taboos that could have been spoken, uttered about 150 plus years ago in this country were religious words. And so swearing as in, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth is exactly the same word as swearing as in to use an expletive. And they're connected by rules against blasphemy. So I think it's the sixth commandment that states, thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. And so the worst swear words you could utter in the past was the name of God, for example, in a demeaning or derogatory fashion. And there was a lot of currency put onto this because if a child, for example, used the name of God inappropriately, they could be threatening their soul, and hence parents would be extremely strict against it. As a society, our attitudes to religion, especially Christianity, have changed significantly, and so we've sort of repopulated the naughty list with the taboo words that I don't need to study. But interestingly, these days the words on the naughty list are almost all from Anglo-Saxon, Leah. So there's your F's and your C's and your S's and whatnot. They're basically from an old German dialect, and the nice equivalents of them are practically all Latin or French derived. What do you imagine might be the significance of that distinction, if any?
Between the word origin.
Yeah, the fact that the words you're not supposed to use are from Old German, and the words that you can use are from French or Latin.
Yeah, I guess specifically drawing upon the Latin, it's almost giving this I don't know, who was speaking the language and what it's associated with. Because if you walk around the city, you see a lot of Latin everywhere, and that kind of automatically imposes this different class almost.
Yeah.
Because I mean, now a lot of people don't know Latin or so I guess it just shows that the different word origin just has different status.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so again, this is something that we can derive from the Norman conquest of 1066, where the Norman invaders would speak Norman, French, and Latin, and what they determined were the peasant class would speak Anglo-Saxon, which is a Germanic language. And so it is just good old-fashioned British/English class snobbery, really, at work, and it's quite arbitrary. I think some people think the Anglo-Saxon words are a bit more ugly as well. They're quite guttural, they're quite consonant heavy and rasping, as opposed to the Latinate cadencing of the non-swearing words. But the distinction is, I would argue, entirely arbitrary. Still, as we've discussed, words have a lot of power, and the way they're used can be extremely powerful, and I think really interesting. And probably the best way to navigate that is not to start dropping C-bombs everywhere or spelling words however you like, but just being aware and asking these sorts of childish questions that we've been asking today. So thank you both ever so much for joining me on this adventure into language. In the next episode, we'll be talking about something totally different, but with a similar format of just discussing complicated ideas. And I look forward to seeing you then. But thank you, Imaan. Thank you, Leah.